Japanese whiskey is a style of whiskey developed and produced in Japan. Whiskey production in Japan began around 1870, but the first commercial production was in 1924 upon the opening of the country's first distillery, Yamazaki. Broadly speaking, the style of Japanese whiskey is more similar to that of Scotch whiskey than other major styles of whiskey. There are several companies producing whiskey in Japan, but the two best known and most widely available are Suntory and Nikka. Both of these produce blended as well as single malt whiskies and blended malt whiskies, with their main blended whiskies being Suntory Kakuben, Jiaoping Square Bottle, and Black Nikka Clear. There are also many special bottlings and limited editions. History. Two of the most influential figures in the history of Japanese whiskey are Shinjiro Torii and Masataka Taketsuru. Torii was a pharmaceutical wholesaler and the founder of Kotobukiya, later to become Suntory. He started importing Western liquor and he later created a brand called Akadama Port Wine, based on a Portuguese wine, which made him a successful merchant. However, he was not satisfied with this success and so he embarked on a new venture which was to become his life's work, making Japanese whiskey for Japanese people. Despite the strong opposition from the company's executives, Torii decided to build the first Japanese whiskey distillery in Yamazaki, a suburb of Kyoto, an area so famous for its excellent water that the legendary tea master Sen no Rikyu built his tea room there. Torii hired Masataka Taketsuru as a distillery executive. Taketsuru had studied the art of distilling in Scotland, and brought this knowledge back to Japan in the early 1920s. Whilst working for Kotobukiya, he played a key part in helping Torii establish the Yamazaki distillery. In 1934 he left Kotobukiya to form his own company, Dainippon Kaju, which would later change its name to Nikka. In this new venture he established the Yoichi distillery in Hokkaido. The first Westerners to taste Japanese whiskey were soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force Siberia who took shore leave in Hakodate in September 1918. A brand called Queen George, described by one American as a Scotch whiskey made in Japan, was widely available. Exactly what it was is unknown, but it was quite potent and probably quite unlike Scotch whiskey. Distilleries. As of 2011, when the Shinshu Mars distillery reopened, there were around 9 active whiskey distilleries in Japan. These include Yamazaki, owned by Suntory, between Osaka, Kyoto on the main island of Honshu Hakushu, also owned by Suntory, in Yamanashi Prefecture on the main island of Honshu Yoichi, owned by Nikka, on the northern island of Hokkaido. Miyajikyo, formerly Sendai, also owned by Nikka, in the north of the main island, near the city of Sendai. Miyagi Prefecture Fuji Gatemba, owned by Kirin, at the foot of Mount Fuji in Shizuoka Chichibu, near Chichibu in Saitama Prefecture. This is the new Chichibu distillery, founded by Ichiro Akuto, grandson of the distiller at Hanyu. It opened in 2008. Shinshu Mars, owned by Hombo Shuzo Co., Ltd., in Nagano Prefecture on the main island of Honshu. White Oak, owned by Igashima Shuzo, Ya, in Hyogo Prefecture on the main island of Honshu. Reputation. Nikka Yoichi single malt woody and vanillic. Before 2000, the market for Japanese whiskies was almost entirely domestic, though this changed in 2001 when Nikka's 10-year Yoichi single malt won Best of the Best at Whisky Magazine's awards. In the blind tasting organized by Whisky Magazine in 2003, the results of which are published in WM No. 30, the winners of the category Japanese whiskies were Hibiki 21 Yo 43% blend, Nikka Yoichi 10 Yo SC 59.9%, Yamazaki Bourbon Cask 1991 60%, Karuizawa 17 Yo 40% pure malt. In the main ranking, covering all categories of whiskey, Hibiki 21 Yo made it to rank 9 and Nikka Yoichi 10 to rank 14. In 2004, the 18-year-old Yamazaki was introduced to the U.S. Japanese whiskies have been winning top honors in international competitions, notably Suntory. 7-8 At the 2003 International Spirits Challenge, Suntory Yamazaki won a gold medal, and Suntory whiskies continued to win gold medals every year through 2013. 8 With all 3 malt whiskies winning a trophy, the top prize, in either 2012 Yamazaki 18 years old and Hakushu 25 years old, or 2013 Hibiki 21 years old, and Suntory itself winning Distiller of the Year in 2010, 2012, and 2013. The resultant acclaim nudged Japan's distilleries to market overseas. Further, in recent years, as of the 22nd of March 2014, a number of blind tastings have been organized by Whisky Magazine, which have included Japanese single malts in the lineup, along with malts from distilleries considered to be among the best in Scotland. On more than one occasion, the results have had Japanese single malts, particularly those of Nikka's Yoichi and Suntory's Yamazaki, scoring higher than their Scottish counterparts. In August 2018, the 50-year-old Yamazaki First Edition went for record $343,000 at a Bonhams auction in Hong Kong. The production of Japanese whiskey began as a conscious effort to recreate the style of Scotch whiskey. Pioneers like Taketsuru carefully studied the process of making Scotch whiskey, and went to great lengths in an attempt to recreate that process in Japan. The location of Yoichi in Hokkaido was chosen particularly for its terrain and climate, which were in many ways reminiscent of Scotland, although financial constraints resulted in the first distillery actually being built in the more convenient location of Yamazaki on the main island. One facet of the style of Japanese whiskey comes from the way in which blended whiskey is produced, and the differing nature of the industry in Japan. Despite the recent rise of interest in single malt whiskies, the vast majority of whiskey sold in the world is still blended. In Scotland, while a particular brand of blended whiskey may be owned by a company that also owns one or more distilleries, it is common for blended whiskey bottlers to trade single malt whiskies. The components of a blend may involve malt whiskey from a number of distilleries, which may be owned by different companies. In Japan, however, the industry is vertically integrated, meaning whiskey companies own both the distilleries and the brands of blended whiskies, and do not trade with their competitors. So a blended whiskey in Japan will generally only contain malt whiskey from the distilleries owned by that same company.